The Biden administration is taking action to combat the growing number of unaccompanied children at the U.S. Mexico border. On Thursday, the president held his first formal press briefing since taking office. During the hour-long address, President Biden outlined his administration's plans to only accept minors seeking asylum in the United States.
The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it.
A recent op-ed published in the Washington Post titled, "The Border Crisis is About Human Pain and Desperation. Why Can't the Media Grasp This?" explores the causes of the latest increase and addresses how the media has struggled to accurately portray the dilemma. León Krauze is an opinions contributor at the Washington Post and a Univision anchor. He joins us now from Los Angeles to discuss his article. León, welcome. Great to have you with us. So what are the elemental reasons so many people are fleeing their homes to seek asylum at the southern border of the United States at this time?
Good to be with you, Tanya. Grown men and women are fleeing Central America, the northern triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico as well, because they fear for their lives. It's as simple as that. They fear extortion, they fear kidnapping. Young women are fleeing because they fear sexual slavery, they fear rape. Young men are fleeing because they fear retribution after they decline, to put it mildly, to join gangs. These people are afraid for their lives, and that's why they are making the long trek to the United States. They are risking everything because the alternative is simply worse.
So you are painting a picture of desperation that you are saying is largely being left out of the media's accounts of what's going on at the southern border. What are the biggest issues you see with the way the media are covering the situation at the border?
I think the media in the United States, my colleagues, and I mean obviously no disrespect, and there are many exceptions to this, have focused for a long time on the political aspect of the immigration debate, the fallout for the Biden administration, whether or not this should be labeled a crisis, that kind of thing. What's not there in the debate, what I haven't seen, and I think we should see certainly, are the concrete stories of human suffering, of despair south of the border. I want to hear the stories of these girls who are fleeing Honduras after being threatened with rape, with sexual slavery. I want to see the stories of what's going on in Tapachula, one of the largest cities in southern Mexico, where the sex trade is booming. I want to hear the stories in the shelters in Tijuana and Matamoros, and I don't see those stories. Those are the stories, by the way, that changed the narrative when the travel ban became an issue, when reporters began covering the concrete human suffering that policy from the Trump administration was causing. Public opinion in America shifted. I think that's needed in this current dilemma that we're facing with immigration and have been facing for a long time.
So it sounds to me a little bit like you're accusing our peers or our colleagues of a certain amount of laziness, just sort of parroting some of the political talking points that they are hearing from, in this case, perhaps coming out of the Republican Party, since they are eager to attack the Biden administration. So how do you think a shift in the narrative could change the way the average everyday American feels about the situation at the border? Do you think that would lead to solving the problem?
I wouldn't call it laziness first. I would call it maybe lack of curiosity. And also we're used to focusing, us journalists, we're used to focusing on politics. Politics is very exciting. The consequences of X or Y policy on politics, on the political dynamic. And this has also had to do, obviously, with the fallout from the Trump administration and its particular dynamic. I think, though, that if we focused on those communities, on the concrete suffering of these people, we could really see a shift. Although we, frankly, don't need a shift, because public opinion is clearly behind immigration reform, clearly behind the path to citizenship for the large undocumented community in the United States. But when it comes to the current crisis, I think it's really important to understand that these kids that are risking everything, and these parents that are risking everything, sending their kids towards the border and into the United States with just a piece of paper with a phone number written in their pocket of an uncle or a grandparent or someone like that, do it because the alternative is worse. And I don't see the story of that alternative, the life in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, being portrayed accurately in American media. And I really do think it's sorely needed.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with you. I do want to point out that during his first formal press briefing, President Biden did address some of the things that you're talking about. You know, he did say, we are trying to work with these countries. We're trying to, you know, put up street lights in dark streets. We're trying to, you know, we're trying to address some of these issues. Of course, the problem is, or not the problem, but, you know, these things take time. And in some ways, the Biden administration doesn't have the luxury of that time with 17,000 minors, you know, in custody at the U.S. border. How would you suggest the Biden administration weighs out the problem of the source countries, or how to work with those countries and fix some of those problems with the very immediate issue at the border right now?
Well, I think there are concrete things that have to happen with what's happening in the United States. First of all, those possible relatives that can come forward and claim these children have to understand that, opposite to what was happening in the Trump administration, they won't be detained and deported themselves. They must know, and the Biden administration is laying this out there very clearly, that they can certainly come forward with the current administration and claim these children. People were very afraid to come forward because they feared the threat of deportation, justifiably so, by the way. That's just one thing that the Biden administration can do, among others, to fix what's happening with the kids in the United States. Now, of course, the matter of the countries
That's a good point.
of origin,
that's a very good point.
The matter of what you can do with the countries of origin, the Northern Triangle, is of course a larger issue. The Biden administration has suggested, as you know, that it wants to invest, and I think that's the correct verb, $4 billion over 4 years in the Northern Triangle. That's $4 billion more than what the Trump administration invested in the Northern Triangle. And the difference that kind of money could make, for example, in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, is simply immense. And those are the kinds of stories, frankly, that we should be telling as well. What kind of difference would a few $100,000 make for the farming communities in the Western Highlands of Guatemala that have been so brutally hit by climate change? I have read wonderful stories in the New Yorker by Jonathan Blitzer. I would love to see that in the evening news as well.
Right, and I agree with you. And the president even addressed the specifics of, we're sending that money directly to contractors, not to the government, to try to avoid corruption. You know, they've thought about these things. And you're right. I think that that piece of it needs to be reported out much more. So, León Krauze, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your insight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.